Good morning. You all are very ambitious. I have skipped more than one opening plenary session in my life, so I'm happy to see you all here. Shortly after Veronica gave me the call asking me to speak, she called me back with a second request. She said, well, Myesha, it's June 19th. That's Juneteenth, so I think you should work that into your speech. And I pondered that for a minute. I couldn't quite figure out how to work Juneteenth into the topic of police and community reconciliation. We have any Texans in the room? No Texans? One? So there's at least one person in the room who knows what Juneteenth is. There's more people who know. Okay, good. For those of you who don't know, Juneteenth commemorates the day that enslaved people in Galveston, Texas, and around Houston, there was a community of about 1,000, first learned about the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years late. As many of you know, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to states in rebellion. So states in rebellion really didn't care much what Abraham Lincoln had to say about who should be free and who should not. So in places like Texas, where it was very difficult to enforce, people just never learned about the Emancipation Proclamation. So I looked a little deeper. I'm like, okay, so if people know what Juneteenth is, that still doesn't link it to what we're doing today. So I did a little more research. How did Juneteenth come to be a thing? How did people outside of Texas start celebrating Juneteenth? And I noted that in 1968, with the Poor People's Campaign that followed the death of Martin Luther King Jr., he had planned the campaign, and his wife and Reverend Ralph Abernathy kept it going. But they decided to end a little bit early. And the way that they decided to end was with a big solidarity rally held on June 19th, 1968. And during that solidarity rally, Solidarity March, which had about 50,000 people, Coretta Scott King encouraged people to go back into their own communities to not only celebrate Juneteenth, but to take the spirit of the Poor People's Campaign with them. And in that way, the Poor People's Campaign became the parent of many of the social justice movements that we are seeing today. Many of the social justice movements that caused the organizations that you represent to be created. So in that way, it's very appropriate that Juneteenth be mentioned today, and I'm glad that Veronica brought it to my attention. So focusing on the idea that the people in this room are inheriting the legacy of the Poor People's Movement, and therefore Juneteenth, and the charge that was given on Juneteenth, I want to take some time to speak to you today about what you can do and what you should be doing in your communities to encourage reconciliation between police and communities. And part of that conversation goes to why I was so hesitant to include Juneteenth in the first place. It's very easy to just jump in and to say to this audience of people who probably already know, well, of course, police and community reconciliation is important, because if police are not seen as legitimate, if they are not respected in the communities where they operate, then crime rises, and therefore violence is more likely to be prevalent in a community. Because individuals in a community who don't respect police most certainly will not report crime. They most certainly will not serve as witnesses or informants. And if they're on the jury, they're not going to believe any testimony that's coming from police. So I could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I get the sense that people in this room probably already understand the link between violence and lack of community police trust and relationships. And also, I took a look at your schedule for the day. There are going to be people much more qualified than me who go into extreme detail about policing and violence prevention and the things that are necessary to make sure that we are working to keep our communities safe. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about the concept of reconciliation and what is necessary to build reconciliation and what the environment for reconciliation not only should be, but what we should understand about that environment as we are moving forward. And I posit to you that reconciliation requires three things. Reconciliation requires truth. Reconciliation requires an end of harm. And reconciliation requires justice. And if we're going to get to those three things, if we are going to work together in our communities as members of a community, as members of police and law enforcement, who are also members of a community, we need to understand and accept the truth of a few things. A lot of people in discussions about race and discussions about tensions between races, tensions between police and communities, like to discuss Martin Luther King Jr. Some people see him as a nice kind of palatable way of getting to the issue, a way of keeping everything very smooth, making sure that there isn't, too much anger, because he wasn't angry, people think. But I think Martin Luther King Jr. and some things that he had to say about policing are informative and may be helpful for understanding if someone as committed to nonviolence and reconciliation as Martin Luther King Jr. saw through the lens of his life a problem between the interactions between police and communities of color, then it might be a little bit easier to understand how people less committed to nonviolence and less committed to reconciliation will find the concept quite difficult. In 1968, after Martin Luther King Jr. had already made very clear that we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality, he went a step further. And he said, when asking Negroes to abide by the law, let us also declare that the white man does not abide by the law. His police forces are the ultimate mockery of the law. Let that settle for a minute. His police forces. His police forces. The idea that police, that law enforcement is not there for the protection of people of color, and in fact exist for the purpose of controlling and harming people of color, was not new in 1968 when Martin Luther King Jr. said those words. It was not new in 1868. It is clearly not new in 2019. It is something that has always existed, and that is a part of the truth that we need to acknowledge and understand if we are to truly reach reconciliation. That's why part of reconciliation, in my opinion, has to include an honest discussion about the history of racialized policing and the role of policing in enforcing institutional discrimination and institutional racism, and to put a finer point on it, white supremacy. From the very first beginnings of policing in the United States, law enforcement, although not referred to it at that time, existed for the purpose of controlling an enslaved population. An enslaved population of people who were not by nature slaves, people who were by nature and natural right free, people who resisted at every turn their enslavement. And because of that resistance, which took the form of running away, took the form of criminal acts like stealing, destroying crops, poisoning, also took the form of revolt and rebellion. Because the system, the community of the United States, needed to keep people who were by nature and natural right free in a condition of slavery, some institution had to exist to enforce what the community wanted. And what the community wanted at that time was slavery. In order to enforce slavery and to cause people who by nature and natural right were free, slave patrols were implemented, and legislation was passed across all the southern states to create slave patrols. The reason that it is important for people today to discuss slave patrols is because there are very current parallels between the practices of slave patrols and something that we are all very, very familiar with, and that is hotspot policing. During slave patrols, it was determined that there were certain places and areas that blacks couldn't go. Slave patrols were designed to watch every movement by people who were enslaved to make sure that they weren't planning a revolt. Also to cement the idea that these slaves who were rebelling through acts of sometimes criminal acts were somehow more prone to criminality than other people. Not seeing the criminality as rebellion, but seeing criminality as something that was natural to black people. Something that still informs, in many instances, policing and policy decisions related to policing that are happening today. The idea that rebellion was likely and that hordes of black people were going to go around and murder whites in their sleep cemented the idea that blacks were dangerous to whites, a concept that still informs much of the policy surrounding policing today. That history of slave patrols and determining that the slave quarters were a place where police could enter indiscriminately, could check indiscriminately for infractions, is very much related to the way hotspot policing occurs today. Heavy police presence, constant checking of individuals, where you're going, why are you going there, no longer require travel papers for blacks who are American citizens like they did during slavery, so that the slave patrols were very, very, very heavily invested in enforcing. But why are you here? Where are you going? Why are you in this neighborhood? That is something, a parallel that we are seeing, but it's not the only historical parallel between policing and a history of enforcing slavery, a history of enforcing institutionalized racism. Moving forward from slavery into Reconstruction, when newly freed black people were attempting to exercise rights that were now granted to them, when those very people who first celebrated Juneteenth were trying to understand and to stand fully in what it meant to be free, there was a great deal of resistance because the community was used to those individuals being enslaved. And quite honestly, the preference of the community was that those individuals remain enslaved. And quite honestly, the economics of the community demanded that those individuals should remain enslaved. So how does the community get what it wants? How does the community enforce a situation that it wants? Police were used. Law enforcement was used. The effort to criminalize the behavior of newly freed people very much parallels the concept and conversation around overcriminalization today. Something that police themselves are not necessarily responsible for, but it's another example of police carrying out the will of those in power and those with money. Something that's informed the thinking about police then, something that informs the thinking about police now. In order to ensure that the work that was done during slavery continued to be done, newly freed blacks had to be criminalized. Behavior associated with them had to be criminalized. Loitering, vagrancy, disobedient acts, disrespectful acts. All of those things were used to ensure that individuals could be arrested and to supply a constant flow of bodies into the convict leasing system. Convict leasing system that ensured that those people who had picked cotton on plantations as slaves were picking cotton on plantations as convicts. To ensure that railroads were built. To ensure that coal was mined. That is a very direct parallel to what we see in communities where behaviors stereotypically associated with people of color are criminalized. The best example of that we see every day is the way that we have enforced our drug laws and the possession of small amounts of marijuana. In addition, misdemeanors, heavy enforcement of quality of life crimes. I believe the term that law enforcement in this room would be familiar with is broken windows policing. Making sure that people are controlled through constant criminalization of their behavior, through constant enforcement of criminal statutes to ensure punishment for individuals. No longer in the form of convict leasing, but now something that may result in, say, fines, fees, constant involvement with the court system. Going further forward from slavery to enforcing segregation, police brutality has been an issue. There are parallels between then and now that are important to understand if reconciliation is to be achieved, if truth is to be dealt with, truth which is the first step of reconciliation. Police brutality, extrajudicial killings have been a constant. Not only during slavery, not only during Reconstruction, when you saw, unfortunately, a number of not only police, but upstanding citizens who were involved in the Klan and various organizations. But even going forward into the modern times, in 1947 and then again in 1951, intellectuals like W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson began to complain to the United Nations that police brutality had risen to such a high level that it actually constituted genocide. While that's arguable, what is clear and what does not require debate is the fact that the community of people of color in the United States, yet again, had reason to say that the police are not here for us. The police are here to enforce an institution that sees us as second class. That is something that existed at that time. It's something that exists now. At the time that the petition before the United Nations was filed, the argument was had that the police carry brutality to the point of killing at the slightest provocation, and sometimes at no provocation. It's the activities and actions of police in committing brutality against people of color, particularly blacks, particularly those who could be charged with any number of crimes, cemented in the minds of communities of color that the justice system was unjust. Within the petition before the UN, they stated that it is a serious question whether any trial of a Negro for crime can be considered fair when those who make arrests, collect evidence, and keep suspects are guilty of so much brutality in the exercise of their daily routines. That is the view of the justice system by individuals who were being policed in 1951. That same statement could come out of the mouth of any Black Lives Matter activist today. There are parallels. That's why reconciliation requires truth, because until police can acknowledge the history that informs the present, reconciliation will not go forward. In 1967, almost 20 years after the petition before the UN, the Kerner Commission was compiled in order to consider what caused an outbreak of rioting and racial disturbance across the United States. One of the issues that needed to be addressed, that commission found, was the abusive relations that police and minority communities have had. Abusive relationships have been a major and explosive source of grievous tensions and disturbance. That is the universe in which we are working. That was in 1967. How many people in this room were born in 1967? That memory does not go away. That memory still informs how people across the United States see policing, especially when there's never been an acknowledgement of the truth of the relationship of policing and the use of police to enforce institutional racism. Once truth has been acknowledged and discussed, the next step of reconciliation is the end of harm. You cannot ask a community to reconcile its relationship with police if active harm is ongoing. Something must be done to address, first and foremost, police killings. It is no longer sufficient, and it is harmful to reconciliation efforts if police do not acknowledge that they can no longer be comfortable with the number of police killings, particularly in communities of color. It's not an issue of whether a shoot was good or not good. It's an acknowledgement of the harm that is done every time there is a news report, every time there is a YouTube video, every time there is another instance of a life that is cut short at the end of a policeman's gun. It is no longer okay for organizations, police organizations, like the Fraternal Order of Police, every time, as a reflex action, to come out and provide justification for a police killing. That continues to do active harm, and reconciliation cannot occur when active harm is ongoing. In addition to the end of police killings, over-policing and under-protection must end. Just like during the time of slave patrols, there was a heavy presence of police in Black communities, just as there is a heavy presence of police in communities of color today. The notion that certain neighborhoods are more dangerous, therefore there should be a higher concentration of police in those neighborhoods. Yet at the same time, the violent crime violent crime clearance rates in those neighborhoods is low. At the same time, neighborhoods with a heavy police presence don't feel safe. They don't feel protected by the fact that police are in their neighborhoods because people are still being killed. People are still being subject to violence. There has to be an end to over-policing and under-protection, and to the systems that allow that to happen. A recent study has shown that police focus on things like fines and fees, revenue-generating policing. For every 1% increase in the amount of time that police spend focusing on fines and fees, issuing tickets, for example, there is a 6% decrease in that police force's ability to clear homicides. Over-policing, under-protection is causing active harm that must end. In addition to truth-telling, to the end of active harm, for true reconciliation to take place, there must be justice. You must establish justice in those communities where active harm by police against members of the community have taken place. The Kerner Commission report suggested very apparently simple solutions in 1967 that for some reason still have not taken hold today. Solutions that would establish justice for people who have been actively harmed by not only a history of enforcing institutionalized racism, but also a present involving active harm. One recommendation was to ensure proper conduct, procedural policing, understanding that the way sometimes things are done, the way an interaction occurs, is much more significant and much more important than why, and even whether or not it's good law. The way that a police officer engages in a stop is more important than whether the police officer should have stopped you in the first place. Is there courtesy? Is there a focus on maintaining and establishing officer presence in a way that encourages good interactions, in a way that ensures that tensions do not escalate? That was a recommendation in 1967. We still don't see that now, and it's an important method for establishing justice for those who have experienced harm. The Kerner Commission also recommended providing more adequate protections. You've got to solve crimes and lower violence in communities of color. Until communities of color are able to see that the police presence in their community is actually helping them, there will never be a feeling of justice concerning communities of color and police. The Kerner Commission also recommended establishing fair and efficient mechanisms for remedying grievances. The resistance by organizations like FOP, other policing organizations, the resistance to consent decrees, the resistance to community policing commissions, it has to end. Communities need a way of saying, this is what happened, this is a problem, I need it to be addressed, and I need to have faith that it will be addressed. Until we have provided truth, until we have ended harm, and until we have established justice, reconciliation between police and the communities that they serve is impossible. Thank you for your time today. I appreciate your consideration.